In the remaining records from that winter, there is a note that has never been explained. The Holloway family turned off the lamps too early that night. Before beginning the reconstruction, the researcher who organized these archives left a simple request in the upper corner of the manuscript, almost as if testing the passage of time. Tell us which city you are viewing us from, and what time it is there now. And then he returns to silence, as if nothing had been said. What is known is that, in 1879, the Holloways were one of the most discreet and, at the same time, most respected families in the region of North Briarfield, a rural community nestled between narrow valleys, dense forests, and hills that spent months on end under fog. They had just over 180 inhabitants, people accustomed to the cold, the long distances between one house and another, and the constant noise of the wind blowing through the forest like a warning that no one could decipher. The Holloway property was located at the southern end of the county, in an area where the trail split between the road to the river and a stretch that led into the forest. At that time, the house was described as simple, solid, built of dark wood, always smelling of freshly burned resin. The main barn was used for livestock and to store tools, but there was another smaller building, almost hidden behind the trees, the night trials shed, an old, narrow, windowless shed used to test equipment at night, especially when the husband, Thomas Holloway, needed to adjust traps or examine parts without being interrupted. The family consisted of Thomas, his wife Helen, and their 6 children. The couple were known to be reserved but not distant. They were seen a few times a month at small gatherings at the local church and almost always returned before sunset. None of the neighbors reported fights, debts, land disputes, or any other conflicts that might suggest internal tensions. On the contrary, the general impression was that the Holloways worked more than they talked, living more inwardly than outwardly. The winter of 1879 was particularly severe. The pastures froze at dawn, the ground cracked at dusk, and the fog was so thick that it accumulated on the doors like white dust. At that time, according to county records, several families complained about the difficulty of preserving food, and damp firewood made it difficult to heat their homes. Even so, the Holloways seemed to cope with the cold as if they were already accustomed to the worst. In the months leading up to their disappearance, the family's behavior did not change noticeably in public. However, a curious fragment of testimony collected decades later from a woman who was only 9 years old at the time indicated that Thomas had begun to visit the smaller shed more frequently at nightfall. She recounted that every time she saw him walking with a flashlight in his hand, she had the impression that he avoided looking back, as if any noise in the woods could catch up with him. The night of the disappearance, or what is believed to have been the beginning of it, began like so many others. The east wind blew steadily. The sky showed no stars, and the moon was hidden by a thick layer of clouds. The last official record of the Holloway's presence was noted in the town's small grocery store ledger on December 12th. Thomas bought flour, kerosene, and rope. Nothing else. What makes this case so disturbing, even after more than a century, is that the entire family was reported missing. But the records mention 18 people connected to the night trials shed that night, a number much greater than the inhabitants of the house. To this day, no one has been able to explain with complete certainty who the other 12 names were that appear in loose, crossed-out notes with no identified origin. In the lower corner of the main file, there is a note written in shaky handwriting. The shed was locked from the inside. It is this detail, small, incoherent, and never clarified, that officially marks the beginning of the mystery. The documents that remained about the Holloway's routine were not written by them. They arrived in fragments: notes from a priest, comments in the margins of an account book, letters from neighbors who moved away years later, testimonies collected when only vague memories remained. Even so, when pieced together, these fragments paint a picture clear enough to imagine, with some accuracy, what it was like before night trials shed became synonymous with absence. Thomas would wake up before dawn. In some records, he is described as a man of few words but predictable gestures, As soon as the sky began to lighten, he would go out to check the fences, inspect the livestock, and observe the state of the surrounding forest. The forest was not just a backdrop, it was both a threat and a source of sustenance. The wood came from there, the game came from there, but so did noises that no one wanted to interpret. Helen, for her part, was remembered mainly for a seemingly trivial detail: her habit of hanging the sheets on a makeshift clothesline between two trees, even in the cold. As soon as the first ray of light appeared, the children grew up divided between obligations and little secret refuges. The eldest helped Thomas with outdoor work, learning to recognize the ground, the signs of rain, the difference between the howl of an animal and the crack of a branch broken by people. The two middle girls, according to an old neighbor's account, spent hours trying to read whatever they could find: worn Bibles, old almanacs, newspapers that took months to arrive. The youngest, often described as nervous, had a habit of sleeping poorly and walking around the house at night as if looking for a crack of safety in every room. The North Briarfield community functioned like a slow but attentive organism. Everyone knew where each family was, what kind of harvest they had, who was struggling with debt, who had argued with whom at the last Sunday sermon. However, when it came to the Holloways, the references were almost always the same: hard-working, reserved, no trouble. There are no reports of public fights or disagreements with neighbors. This does not mean that there was no tension, only that if there was, it was well hidden within the wooden walls and in the sustained silences at the table. Some details repeated in later testimonies reveal something important: the feeling that, despite the discretion, there was a certain permanent weight in that house. A woman who, decades later, recalled being invited to dinner only once, reported that there was no uncontrolled laughter, no arguments, no emotional outbursts. There was a kind of exaggerated care to keep everything in its place. The cutlery was precisely placed, the chairs aligned with the table, the plates distributed according to a fixed order. That excess of order to her seemed more like an attempt to avoid something than a simple habit of organization. The night trials, shed in this context, occupied an ambiguous position. Officially, it was a test shed, where Thomas kept tools, traps, metal parts, and work equipment. Unofficially, it is described as the place that children were clearly instructed to avoid. It was not a common barn. It was not a place to play. One of a neighbor's children, in a testimony collected almost 50 years later, said that the doors of that shed always seemed darker than the rest of the property, a phrase that, although poetic, may simply reflect the memory of a child impressed by what adults whispered. Records indicate that throughout the fall of 1879, Thomas began spending more time in the smaller shed. Neighbors report seeing the lamp lit there for several nights in a row, sometimes even after all the other rooms in the house were already dark. There is no record of him being involved in anything explicitly illicit or dangerous. What there is are vague observations, phrases such as, "he seemed preoccupied," or "he walked more stooped," as if he were carrying too much weight on his shoulders. Helen, on the other hand, was described as being a little more distracted, looking out the window at times when she would normally be busy with household chores. The family's daily life, seen from the outside, was a succession of small, repeated gestures. The weekly trip to the grocery store, the occasional visit to church, the children walking along the path to the river on their rare days off. But in some testimonies, a subtle change begins to appear. One neighbor recounts that Helen began to decline simple invitations, such as having coffee at another property, always claiming that Thomas needed her close to home. Another person recounts that, at a certain point, the children no longer crossed the path to the river as often, as if they had received some stern instruction not to stray far. Winter brought with it an even thicker silence. The wind blowing through night trials. Shed made the wood creak irregularly, a sound that some neighbors could hear even from a distance on particularly quiet nights. A diary entry by a traveling teacher who visited the region for a few weeks mentions that one afternoon as he passed by the property, he thought he heard voices inside the shed like a quiet argument. However, when he looked, he saw no one. At the time, he chalked it up to travel fatigue. As the days passed, small anomalies accumulated. One resident recorded that on 2 occasions he found footprints in the snow leading from the woods to the Holloway house, but not in the opposite direction. Another noted that during a windstorm, he saw the shed door slam twice, as if someone had pushed it from the inside out, although the next morning, the locks were intact. Taken separately, all of these accounts could easily be dismissed as observational errors. But when placed side by side, they began to form a disturbing pattern. Within the family, what can be inferred is even more delicate. An incomplete letter, found years later among other county documents, appears to have been written by Helen to a distant sister. The paper is stained, the handwriting is irregular, and several words are missing. Still, some phrases are legible. The nights are longer than winter warrants. He hardly sleeps, and the children are beginning to notice. There is no explicit mention of what exactly was changing, but the last preserved line is particularly disturbing. If anything happens, I want you to know that I tried to keep everyone inside. It is at this point that the archives begin to converge on the same feeling, that in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, there was something in North Briarfield that was pushing everyone indoors, not only physically, but also emotionally. Families closed their doors earlier, lights were turned off sooner, conversations ended with a casual but concerned, "You'd better be back before dark." And at the center of this movement, the Holloway's routine became increasingly closed off, as if the house and shed formed a small world, separate from the rest of the county. The most disturbing detail, however, appears in a seemingly technical record made by a notary employee. He noted that, on a date close to the day of the disappearance, unusual activity was observed on the Holloway property, with a number of people exceeding the usual number of residents. There is no explanation for this note. There is no list of names, nor any description of who these visitors might be. Just the dry sentence, without comment, as if the clerk himself had not had the time or the courage to elaborate on what he saw. It is there, in that simple mention of more people than usual circulating on the property, that everyday life begins to crack. Until then, everything could be explained by the cold, the routine of work, the difficulties of an isolated life. From that moment on, the archives suggest that, at some point, the Holloway house ceased to be just a home and began to function on some nights as a meeting place. In the last week, before the estimated date of disappearance, 3 different witnesses claimed to have seen flashlights lit not only in the house, but also in the night trials shed, and on the path connecting the shed to the forest trail. That was the last time anyone could count, from a distance, more than 2 shadows moving on the property at the same time. After that, all that remains is the white silence of the following days and the inescapable fact that, shortly thereafter, 18 people would be officially considered missing. When county investigators finally organized the reports from that night, they realized that nothing began with a big event. There were no screams, no running, no lights visible from afar, no cries for help. The disappearance of the Holloway family and the 12 other people connected to the case seems to have unfolded like winter in that valley. Slowly, inevitably, and silently. The last verified confirmation of the family's movement occurred in the late afternoon of December 14th, 1879. Helen was seen closing the windows earlier than usual, while one of the children gathered firewood behind the steep terrain. Thomas, according to a distant neighbor, was walking with a burlap sack toward the night trials shed, carrying the kind of weight that is only carried when one wants to finish a task before nightfall. The wind was blowing stronger than normal. The wind chill, according to later records, reached levels unusual for that region, to the point of making the exterior boards of the house creak as if they were being pulled inward. Night fell quickly, so quickly that many residents described that day as a sunset that came without warning. When the light disappeared completely, only 2 lamps remained lit on the property, one inside the main house and one in the smaller shed. It is at this point that the tone of the historical narrative takes on more defined contours. 3 witnesses reported that, around 8 p.m., shadows were moving between the house and the night trial shed, as if someone were coming and going several times, carrying something in their arms. The shadows did not appear agitated. They seemed determined, steady, almost routine. This has always intrigued investigators because it is behavior incompatible with any emergency situation. What happens inside the house after that time can only be reconstructed from fragments. A neighbor claimed to have heard Helen's low voice saying something twice, words she could not understand, but which she described as too quiet for that time of night and for that wind. Another person, passing by on the path before reaching the river, claimed to have seen the lamp in the shed turn on once, as if someone were testing the intensity of the light against the darkness. Around 9:30 p.m., all accounts agree on one point. The smaller shed was lit from the inside out with unusual brightness, shining through the cracks in the wooden boards and drawing lines of light on the frozen ground. It wasn't enough light to illuminate the forest, but it was strong enough to impress those passing by on the path. Decades later, researchers noted that this type of lighting did not correspond to the usual brightness of an oil lamp. The intensity described suggested the simultaneous use of several light sources. The wind worsened. The temperature dropped sharply. And, around the property, the silence took on an almost physical quality. There are no records of dogs barking, distant howls, or creaking in the forest. It was as if, on that particular night, the entire forest had held its breath. The last visual testimony before the disappearance occurred shortly after 10 o'clock at night. A woodcutter returning home reported seeing two figures standing in front of the shed, one clearly taller than the other. The smaller one seemed to be held by the arm, as if resisting staying there. The man could not identify whether they were adults or children due to the distance and lack of natural light. He tried to wave, but got no response. As he walked away, he saw the shed door slowly open, without creaking, revealing only a narrow rectangle of yellowish light. The two figures entered. The door closed. This is the last confirmed record of any human activity at the night trials shed. After that, the timelines begin to blur. Some witnesses claim to have seen the light from the shed flickering between 11 and 11:30. Others say they saw a dim light, closer to midnight, coming from the window of the main house, as if someone were walking around with a lamp inside the rooms. However, none of these statements are precise enough for the official report. What is known for certain is that around 2 in the morning, the windstorm hit the valley with unusual force. The sky, which was already dark, became completely contrastless, and the snow began to fall sideways, as if pushed by invisible hands. From this point on, any testimony is compromised. No one else saw any lights. No one else saw any movement, and no one, absolutely no one, heard anything that could indicate a conflict, an accident, or an escape attempt. The absence of sound was, for the investigators, the most disturbing point. When the next morning arrived, with the sun trying to break through the grey clouds, the Holloway property seemed frozen not only by snow, but by immobility. The house had its door closed, its windows blocked from the inside, and no smoke coming from the chimney, which was strange, since the family depended on the wood stove for heat. The path connecting the forest to the shed was covered with clean snow, with no recent footprints. And above all, the night trials shed remained closed, the lock intact, and a clear layer of ice around the lock. Investigators were only able to enter the shed after breaking the lock. Inside, they found the remains of unlit lamps, circular marks from something that had been dragged across the floor, and a set of makeshift benches, as if several people had sat there during some kind of meeting. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no broken objects. There was no indication that 18 people had left the place in a hurry. The only significant piece of evidence was trapped between two boards, hidden enough to suggest that perhaps no one intended for it to be found. It was a piece of dark, partially burned fabric with threads that did not match any garment listed in the Holloway family's inventories. The fabric appeared to have been torn, not cut. But the most disturbing detail is another. The shed could only be locked from the inside. This information is highlighted in the files, repeated 3 times in different reports, as if each investigator, upon noting the fact, had felt the same growing perplexity. If the padlock was intact on the outside, and all the internal locks were activated, The question that has been echoing for almost a century and a half remains exactly the same as it was on the morning of December 15th, 1879. How and where did 18 people get out of there? From this point in the reconstruction, there are no further descriptions of the Holloway family alive or present in any document. Everything that comes after, rumors, interpretations, belated testimonies, arises from absence. The news of the Holloway's disappearance spread through North Briarfield with the speed of something no one wanted to believe. Early in the morning, when the grocery store opened its doors and they realized that Thomas would not be coming to buy supplies, some neighbors commented on how strange it was not to see smoke coming from the chimney. By noon, there were already men on their way discussing whether they should go there. By evening, it was no longer a discussion. It was an obligation. The first search was conducted by the neighbors even before the authorities arrived. They searched the property carefully, like someone entering the home of someone who had always seemed too harmless to cause concern. They found clean dishes stored in the cupboard, clothes folded on the beds, dry firewood stacked near the door, and the lamps turned off, as if someone had taken care to finish their routine before leaving. There were no signs of a struggle. Nothing had been moved. The house simply seemed empty, as if everyone had gone out for a few minutes to take care of something in the woods, and never returned. The night trials shed, however, had a different effect. The makeshift benches, the marks on the floor, the remains of lamps burning together. Everything indicated that there had been other people there the night before. This coincided with the mysterious note in the log about unusual movement. It was the first point on which the reports agreed. The Holloways were not completely alone that night. The most immediate, and perhaps most logical theory, was that some kind of meeting had been arranged in the shed. But a meeting for what? The Holloways had no history of political, religious, or business meetings, nor were they known for hosting travelers. The files show that, in the days that followed, many attempted to reconstruct the list of possible visitors. The result always reached the same dead end. No one in that small, observant community remembered seeing strangers traveling on the roads in the weeks prior. And yet, 18 people had disappeared. The arrival of the authorities only added to the confusion. First, 2 men from the county arrived. Then, reinforcements from a neighboring town. The investigation included searches in the forest, tracking footprints in the snow, checking abandoned trails, and interviewing everyone who lived within a 15-kilometer radius. Nothing. No blood, no clothes, no abandoned objects, no signs of a hasty escape, no signs of violence. The only physical trace, that dark fabric caught between the boards, was sent for rudimentary analysis to another city, but it came back inconclusive. The report only said that it does not correspond to any clothing known to be on the property. This fueled speculation. Perhaps someone from outside was involved. Perhaps the group that was in the shed had unknown intentions. Perhaps the fabric was just a remnant of old cloth, with no meaning. Nothing could be ruled out. Nothing could be proven. As the days passed, the community began to change. Some families began locking doors they had never locked before. Others left lamps on all night. The local pastor lengthened his sermons, trying somehow to explain the inexplicable with biblical words that seemed insufficient for such a concrete case. Fear, for the first time in years, became a recurring theme in small conversations at the market, the church, and on the trail. Over the following weeks, several ambiguous statements were noted, small fragments that, in isolation, explain nothing, but together form an incomplete mosaic. A woodcutter swore he had seen an unknown man on the trail 2 days before the disappearance. A woman claimed to have heard muffled laughter coming from the forest, but acknowledged that it could have been just an echo. A child said he had found strange marks in the snow, as if something had been dragged, but they were erased by the wind before the adults could verify them. None of this is solid. None of this stands on its own. And yet the investigators recorded everything, as if every little detail might one day fit together. But the most human, and perhaps the most painful revelation came months later, when old letters, incomplete correspondence, and belated testimonies were gathered. Amid that pile of papers, a discrete pattern began to emerge. The Holloway family, in recent months, had been reaching out to other families who were experiencing extreme hardship, crop failures, debt, illness, food shortages. The winter of 1879 had been severe, and many were desperate. There are records that Thomas had offered help to anyone who needed it, especially to men who, out of pride, did not ask for it directly. Helen, for her part, had donated part of her reserves to neighbors with small children. One account mentions that, one night, she brought firewood to a house where the father was bedridden. This is where the investigation takes a different turn. One hypothesis gained traction, not because of the violence of the event, but because of its tragic humanity, that the Holloways had organized an emergency meeting in the night trials shed with families who were about to lose everything that winter. Perhaps they discussed solutions. Perhaps they distributed provisions. Perhaps they just offered shelter for a few hours. That would explain the large number of people at the site. It would explain the lamps. It would explain the benches. It would explain the comings and goings on the night of the disappearance. But it does not explain the disappearance. The theory most accepted by historians, not because of its certainty, but because of its plausibility, is that the group, upon leaving the shed, attempted to reach a safer area of the valley, guiding children, the elderly, and the infirm. It was a risky journey in the midst of the storm that hit the county that morning. Deep snow, crosswinds, dark woods, uneven terrain. It was easy to lose your way. It was easy to get separated. It was easy not to return. There is insufficient evidence to confirm that this is true, but among all the hypotheses, this is the only one that requires no more mystery than winter and human frailty. The detail that remains unanswered and that persists in the investigator's account is the intact padlock on the shed, the internal locks engaged, the absolute silence. Some believe that the last to leave locked the door from the inside and escaped through a side opening that was only used for ventilation. Others suggest that the padlock was closed later by someone who returned briefly, perhaps in an attempt to protect the shed from the storm. None of these possibilities is satisfactory, but all are at least possible. And so the final revelation is not a fact, but a bitter realization. The Holloway's disappearance was not a sudden, criminal, or inexplicable act. It was the sum of exhaustion, despair, and winter. It was a human decision made on a night when everyone was trying to survive as best they could. And yet, even with this understanding, something remains unspoken that no report has been able to convey: the silence left behind by the house. A silence so profound that even decades later, those who pass by the path still slow their pace without realizing it. Decades have passed since the snow erased the last footprints on the Holloway Trail. When the files began to be reassembled, now by hands that knew none of those faces, the case ceased to be just a disappearance and became a study of how time chooses what to preserve and what to abandon. A county historian, writing almost half a century later, described the episode as an echo that never found a wall to bounce off. Perhaps that is the most accurate image. Over the years, North Briarfield has changed. The dirt road has become a wider highway, the houses have moved closer together, and the once isolated valley has begun to welcome more travelers and more stories. But anyone who walks the South Trail, the one that passes near the former Holloway property, realizes that there, specifically there, time has not moved forward with the same disposition. There is something about the silence of that curve that seems heavier than the wind. The trees have grown, but they still maintain the same distance between them, as if respecting a space that does not belong to the present. Restored documents show that in the 20 years following the disappearance, there were intermittent attempts to reopen the case. Reinforced search parties, investigation of possible escape routes, re-examination of the fabric found in the shed. Nothing provided new answers. Reports became scarcer, memories more fragile, and what was once a mystery began to become an uncomfortable chapter in the valley's history. Uncomfortable because it reminded people that even in small, attentive communities, something can be lost forever without a trace. There is a particularly significant passage in a 1921 letter written by a local chronicler who revisited the now abandoned property. He describes the feeling of entering the empty house, where the air seemed older than the dust itself. He said he walked slowly through the rooms, feeling that he must not make a sound, as if disturbing the silence would be disrespectful to those who had lived there. In the shed, he found the floor cold and untouched, but he felt, or thought he felt, the presence of a space that had been occupied by many people at the same time, as if the air still held the memory of their collective breath that night. What remains, however, are not the subsequent interpretations, but the gaps. The Holloway story is mainly composed of absences: absence of bodies, absence of visible conflict, absence of direct answers. And curiously, therein lies its strength. Each silence preserved in the archives reveals a layer about how those families lived, how they dealt with winter, with poverty, with pride, and with shared fear without words. The researcher who organized the latest version of the file, the one who left the request for the viewer to say where they were viewing it from, wrote in the epilogue that he did not find the case tragic because of the presumed death, but because of what it represented: a group of people trying to survive together, not knowing that it would be the last night for all of them. He believed that if there is anything to be learned from these archives, it is not the outcome, but what precedes it. The small decisions, the help offered in silence, the mutual care, the lamps lit at the same time, the simple gesture of gathering those who were losing their balance. It is possible, and perhaps even probable, that all these people were trying to reach a safer point in the valley and simply failed to get through the storm. There is no heroism in that. There is no mystery in the extraordinary sense of the word. There is, yes, vulnerability. There is humanity. There is fear. And there is a desperate attempt to protect each other on a night when winter gave no respite. Today, the Holloway property no longer exists. The boards were washed away by time, by successive winters, by residents who needed wood for repairs. All that remains of the smaller shed are marks on the ground, so faint that they need side lighting to be seen. Even so, those who know the story often pause there for a moment, not to try to understand what happened nor to seek answers, but to acknowledge what that night meant. What remains is the fact that 18 people disappeared without anyone seeing them leave. The silence remains. The idea remains that some events can only be recounted by those who come much later, without the pretense of resolving anything, only of recording. In the last paragraphs of the manuscript, there is a sentence almost erased by time, written in tired handwriting, which seems to summarize not what happened, but what was missing. Sometimes, winter takes more than can be recovered, and after that, nothing, only silence.